Hi, welcome back to Dr. Heather. This is yarrow, what you're looking at now. It's one of my favorite herbs of all time. It's got so many uses. I really love it. If you've checked out my Instagram and my Living in the Light Today WordPress, you've probably seen it before, so maybe you recognize it. At this point of the season, it's early September in the Northeast and it's reaching the end of its growing season, so what you see now are really mostly just these feathery leaves. We do have one flower left on this plant, so this is what it looks like in case you're not familiar. But I have picked a small handful of yarrow leaves that we're going to use in a project today. So I'm going to bring you inside and show you one of many ways that we can use yarrow for medicine. So here we are inside. I've got my medicine project going here in different stages so that you guys can kind of see the steps of the process as I talk you through. So the pieces of yarrow that we just brought in, I ripped into smaller pieces and then covered with water. This pot is actually a pot that I just finished up, so this one is totally done. And I'll show you in a minute what we're going to do with that. But if you guys watched the herbal infusion video that I made very recently, you'll know all about what we're doing here. Basically, we're just making an herbal infusion, also known as a tea. This particular one that we're making today with the yarrow is not for drinking. I mean, you could drink it. There's nothing wrong with taking yarrow internally. But we're using it for a different purpose today. And for that purpose, what I wanted was a really concentrated brew. So that's why I have just a little bit of plant material just covered with water, basically, because I wanted it to be really concentrated with all those medicinal plant parts. And so if you guys have checked out my blog post about yarrow styptic powder, you'll know that yarrow is actually, it has many uses. One place where it excels in the body is actually with regulating the thickness of blood. And so if you've heard of an adaptogen, I definitely want to make videos, or at least one video, about adaptogenic herbs in the future because they're really neat and the way that they work is amazing. They're so good for the body and they really help regulate things and bring everything in the body back toward homeostasis. The way that I think of yarrow and how it affects the blood is almost like an adaptogen for the blood. And so if it needs to be thicker, the yarrow can make it thicker. If it needs to be thinner, the yarrow can help make it thinner. And that helps explain why it can be used as something like a styptic. And so the reason that I decided to make this yarrow tea this week was because a family member of mine had oral surgery done. And so she came home with stitches in her gums and they really weren't stopping bleeding very well. So I do actually have some yarrow styptic powder on hand because I've dried some yarrow in the past and I just had that readily available. But in a case like that where you really don't want to get any potential pieces of, even if they're small pieces of powder or any plant parts in the wound, one of the best ways of delivery then is just to infuse a liquid with those medicinal plant parts and then use that liquid to kind of hold in the mouth. Remember, with oral surgery, what the dentists and oral surgeons will advise is that you're not sucking from a straw, you're not swishing anything too vigorously around in your mouth because you don't want to disrupt that tissue as it's healing or cause bleeding. And so what I had this family member of mine do is just to take some of this infusion, the yarrow infusion, once cooled of course, and then just hold that in her mouth. So take a mouthful of it, hold it for 30 seconds or a minute, and then you don't want to spit too forcefully either after you've had dental work done. So I just had her let that kind of fall out of her mouth, and then rinse with a new mouthful, and do that a few times. And so I'm just going to show you guys pretty much how I worked this out, but all you're really doing is, you can strain if you want through an actual strainer. I just kind of pour off, since it's just so little liquid, don't really need a strainer, but just being sure, again, to make sure that you don't get those plant parts in there, because what you don't want is that you get pieces of plant stuck in a wound somewhere that could hinder healing or cause infection. So basically I was just having my family member hold a little bit of this in her mouth. When she was done, let that drop into the sink and do a few rounds of that, and it really helps stop the bleeding very well. And again, so easy to make. Yarrow is growing all over right now in the Northeast, even if it is toward the end of its growing season, so it's very readily accessible if you know how to wild harvest it and where to find it. If not, you can certainly buy dried yarrow herb, and you can make an infusion with this dried herb too. It doesn't have to be fresh. And so again, you're basically gathering or buying a little bit of the yarrow, putting it in the bottom of a pot, covering it with water. You don't need too much water because, again, you want it to be pretty concentrated. And with an herb like this, if you're making an infusion, even if you wanted to have someone use it, like let's just say 2 to 3 times a day for a few days, it'd probably be best, even if you stored it in the fridge, to make it new at least every day, just because it is only water. There's really no preservative in there, so it can go bad. And the plant medicine is really most potent the fresher it is. So again, you make your herbal infusion. So about, again, 5 minutes. We had this on the stove. If you want to let it go a little bit longer, that's okay. Remember, with our last herbal infusion video, we talked about how 5 minutes is a pretty ideal time to infuse softer, leafier plant parts like leaves or flowers. If you let it go a little bit longer, that's when you start to extract things like tannins, which are bitter, but they're also astringent. And so in this case, actually having some astringent properties in our mouth rinse wouldn't be such a bad thing if we're trying to stop bleeding. So that's fine to let it go 5 minutes or a little bit longer. And then strain it. Make sure you get all the plant parts out. And then you're left with your finished product that you can hold in your mouth or swish in your mouth to really help with reducing bleeding. And remember that yarrow, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, has so many medicinal properties. One of them is that it's also a vulnerary, which means that it really helps to heal tissue that it touches. And so many reasons to use yarrow as a mouth rinse after something like oral surgery, and again, many other uses that we cover in the blog post and that we'll hopefully talk about in future videos, because there's so much to yarrow that it deserves more attention. But hope this was helpful and informative for you today. Thanks for being with us. I'm Dr. Heather, MD.